So this elderly woman, get ready. This elderly woman arrives at church. The usher opens the door for her, greets her, good morning, asks her where she'd like to sit. She says, I want to sit in the front row. And the usher looks at her and says, well, ma'am, I don't know if you want to sit in the front row because our preacher's really boring. And she looks at him and says, do you know who I am? And he says, no, ma'am. He said, well, I'm the pastor's mom. And he looks right back at her and says, well, do you know who I am? And she goes, no. He says, good. All right. So today we're going to be speaking from 1 Samuel chapter 17. And, it wasn't a real hard sermon to prepare because we're going to be talking about David and Goliath today. David and Goliath, I was thinking about it. It's not really a sermon you hear preached in the sanctuary a lot. It's a story that we learn as kids in Sunday school. It's a story that they teach in children's church, but it's not really a story we preach about from the sanctuary. So we're going to talk about David and Goliath today. Before we start, I'd like to really, really quickly talk about how we got to this point. So we've been doing a series called You Are Anointed. And we would like to really dig into what it means to be anointed, what it means to be protected under Christ's blood, the empowerment that we receive from being anointed. And so in the first message, we talked about the danger of being the same. The danger of being the same as the rest of the world. And we talked about King Saul and all the mistakes that they made whenever they chose King Saul by choosing a standard that was not divine. And by doing that, we really examined the pitfalls of being the same as the world around us. The second message we preached was last week, and we talked about searching out the unseen will that Christ has for our lives, the unseen problems that we might be facing, the unseen problems for this church, the pitfalls, whatever we're going through in life, whether it be a problem, whether it be growth in ministry, we were searching out the unseen. And as Samuel was looking for David to anoint him, not knowing who he was going to be whenever he was looking for him, God just told him to go. I think the most important thing that I learned from that message is whenever we're seeking out the unseen, we need to think like God. We don't need to think like ourselves. What did God tell Samuel whenever he was searching out David? He says, I do not look at the things that men look at. I look at the heart. So the most important thing that I learned last week was that we need to think like God. And so this week I've entitled the message, Facing the Giant. What happens whenever the unseen is revealed, and it is revealed in the form of a giant? So we would like to examine that today. The meaning of facing the giant. It could be that we're facing a giant problem. It could be that we're facing a giant amount of growth that is required from us. Whatever that has been revealed, well, maybe we think it's too big. Maybe we think that we can't do it. And what we're really going to examine today is that when the unseen turns out to be gigantic, really the only thing that we need to do is be ready. Because we can't guess about what's going to happen. We can't worry about something that's not even here yet. I heard a preacher the other day say that if something else happened today, it would be 2 weeks before you'd even get a chance to worry about it. So we can't worry about that. What we need to focus on is being ready. And that's why we're examining the life of David. And David and Goliath is going to take us 2 weeks to get through. So this week and next week is going to be David and Goliath. But I'm not sure how far we're going to take the life of David. I hope that we keep to get going, but I'm going to go where I feel like we're being led to go. So in chapter 17, verse 1, for our first point today, we want to read verses 1 through 11. And our first point is going to be when the unseen becomes visible. In chapter 17 and verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sokoah in Judah. And they pitched camps at Ephes-Dammim between Sokoah and Azekah. And Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. And the Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp, and he was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves and a bronze javelin and was slung on his back. And his spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, and his shield bearer went ahead of him. And Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, then you will become our subjects and serve us.' And now the Philistines said, 'This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other.' On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified." Let's go to the Lord in prayer. We thank you so much, Lord, for being able to come here today, for being able to meet and fellowship with other Christians, to start off our week with your word, to start our week off right. We pray that you would give us strength, Lord. We pray that you would bless this service with your powerful spirit. In your name we pray. Amen. So our first point today is going to be when the unseen becomes visible. Whenever the problem, that you're facing, when the growth that you're facing, when the task that is being asked of you has become visible. And when it has become visible, oh my goodness, this is not what I was expecting. It has become visible in the form of a giant. And let's look at Goliath first. Let's go through the scriptures. So depending on the way that you research it, because their units of measurement were not a standard unit of measurement like we measure today, Goliath was anywhere between 7 feet or a little over 9 feet. And from the studies that I did, it looked like he was probably 8.5 to 9 feet. So we typically kind of round off, but he was about 9 feet tall. Like I said, it depends on which commentary you use. It depends on how literal they get. The commentary that I was using was the pulpit commentary that Paul uses, and it said that he was 8.5 feet. So it also says that he was a champion. I think that's something that we don't usually kind of hone in on when we talk about Goliath. What does it mean whenever to say that he was a champion? Does it mean that he had been in one fight? Probably not. I mean, if you become a boxer and you have one boxing match, are you a champion? No, they go through they could probably go through 100 fights before they even get a real fight, a sanctioned fight. They go through a lot of amateur fights. A lot of them grow up in boxing through Golden Gloves and all the other amateur organizations. So Goliath was probably a soldier from a very young boy. And he was a champion. Now, how many people did he kill? I can't tell you that. My guess would be he probably had fought and killed a lot of people for them to consider him a champion. So this was a mighty, mighty warrior that stood in front of the ranks of Israel. Israel was on one hill. And the Philistines were on another hill, and there's a valley in between them with a ravine. And so Goliath comes out, and he defies them. He challenges them. And why did he do this? And I think the answer is not so obvious, because the Israelites had fortified their situation, and the Philistines had fortified their situations. So for them to go to war, there would have been a great number of casualties. They would have, and the Philistines knew this, that Israelite, they basically, being on opposite hills, they both had good position. And anybody that went down, they were going to suffer a lot of casualties. So they sent their champion out to defy the Israelites and to defy, very importantly, defy the God of the Israelites. His weight, the armor that he wore, I find this kind of stuff really interesting. The armor that he wore weighed 200 pounds. So the armor that he wore probably weighed more than David did. And it says that the spear that he held, that he would have had on his back, was 25 pounds in weight. Now, there's an important detail whenever it says the spearhead was made out of iron. Why is that important? Because it will go through bronze, which is what their armor was made out of. So this is not a simple or typical foe that was standing in front of them. But by standing down in the valley and defying them, and more literally, what he did whenever he says, I defy you, if you look at the literal translation, it says, I cast scorn on you. And not only was he casting scorn onto the Israelites, he was casting scorn onto our God. And what do we see in verse 10 and 11? It says they were terrified. Now, why were they terrified? Because the Israelites had put their faith in man. They had put their faith in a standard that was not divine. Okay? The entire time that the Israelites, throughout the Bible, until now, until the book of 1 Samuel, they had put their faith in God. God had been their leader. They started looking at the countries around them. What did they do? We want to be like the other countries. So what happens whenever you're like the other countries? Or whenever you're faced with a gigantic foe, you have the same fear that they have. They had chosen Saul. God did not choose, or Saul did not choose God, so therefore God turned his back on Saul. And so they stood in front of a man who was defying their God, and they trembled with fear. Now, is that how we're supposed to live as Christians? Is that our duty? Is that our goal on this earth? Not at all. That's why we do not put our faith in man, and we do not put our faith in a standard that is not divine. Our standard is divine. Because they were doomed to fail under a standard that was not their own, because they had put their hope into man. And by standing in front of them, he opposed their God. And what this was, why I think this is so important for us to analyze, is by defying their God, what they were in was they were in a spiritual war that was presenting itself as a physical war. That sound anything like what we got going on today? We are in a spiritual war with radical Islamists. But it's being presented as a physical war. And I'm not going to get into politics, but I'd like for you to see the parallels between the two. How they were standing in front of a man that was defying their God, but it was presenting themselves as a physical war, and they were letting their own doubts get in the way of what God could accomplish. So we need to be very careful that we do not do that in our own church. That we do not let the attitude that is going on in our country right now, that we need to be tolerant. We need to make sure that the air of tolerance, we don't lower our own standard for this church. because God's standard doesn't change. And if we want to partake in his blessings, we need to meet the standard. We don't need to be tolerant. We need to preach his word. Now, we need to preach it with love, but we do not need to put our hope in man. Our second point today, the first being when the unseen becomes visible, comes from verses 12 through 19. And it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephraimite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. And Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. And Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. And the first was Eliab. The second was, man, I practiced this. I got it wrong last week, and I've already forgotten it. Abinadab. I told Jamie to write it down for me phonetically. You do not know how embarrassing that is. Okay. The second was Abinadab. And the third was Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to the camp. And take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance for them. And there was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against their enemies. Okay, so when I read this, you may think it's funny. You may not. I thought it was funny. I know funny, so. He brought them grain, he brought them bread, and he brought them cheese. He brought them grilled cheese. I thought that was funny. Now, I know the cheese was supposed to go to his commander. I think Granny's down there correcting me. The cheese was supposed to go to his commander as a gift and as a bribe. But when I read this, I thought, okay, he's bringing bread, he's bringing grain. So you got whole grain bread, and then you got cheese. He's bringing them a healthy grilled cheese sandwich. In verse 5, though, we learn that several years had now passed since David had gone into service for Saul. So since chapter 16 and chapter 17, several years have now passed. David's a little older, and we're going to find out later, Saul had even forgotten about him. But what do we see about David after all these years have passed? He basically split his time between working for his father and working for the king. So what was he doing? He was serving. He was working. And we still see that he had a servant's heart. Now, 3 of Jesse's sons had followed Saul into war. He had joined their army. Now, there's sort of an argument about why did David have to bring them food? Because they would have had taxes levied on them. And so what we really see is a major pitfall of them choosing a king. This is what Israel chose to do this. They chose a king. And so what are they? They're forced to pay taxes. Not only are they forced to pay taxes, they're forced to bring their own stinking food and a bribe for the commander. So another pitfall of putting your faith in man. Man only serves himself. And what we really want to do is we want to have a servant's heart. And David at this time was biding his time between the two. And not only were the Israelites terrified of this champion, he had defied them for 40 days and 40 nights. He had come out and challenged them, and they sat there and they did nothing. And I think that's very sad. I think it's very sad for their own spiritual condition. I think it's very sad for us that this sort of stuff still happens in our country, how people won't stand up for God because they're afraid of what they could or they might not be able to do by putting their faith in a standard that they can see. But what we're going to see out of David is the incredible servant's heart that he had. And why did he have the servant's heart? Because the whole time he was serving. He was working and he was serving. Now he had been anointed, but we don't see him sitting on a throne with a crown on his head with the people serving him. He has to go back to the field and go back to work. And what God has done is he has used the events that are seemingly unconnected. And I love it when this happens because I've seen it happen in my own life. Seemingly unconnected events come all together for a great victory for God. And what got him there was a servant's heart. It kept him ready. Now, this readiness is what I really want to talk about today. Because you guys you've heard me come up here and say more than once about not being ready yet. I didn't have enough time. You know, Paul may have caught me off guard and I wasn't ready. Now, whose fault was that? That was my fault. And I think we're all guilty of using the, not ready excuse yet. I'm not ready. I have to give me more time. I need time to plan. And that's great. But whenever we're facing a problem, are you going to let God use you? Or are you going to, I'm not ready yet. And whenever I was thinking about this not being ready, whenever Paul was sick, and it was the service that we had the week before Christmas, it was our Christmas service. And he called me a little after 9 o'clock Sunday morning and told me that he was too sick to make it. Could I preach? And there was a light bulb that came on in my head. And God used this moment to help me. And this light bulb moment, what it was that I needed to be ready all the time. There was no longer serving halfway. That I needed to be ready all the time. And that's our message. We need to be ready because if you're faced with a giant, I don't know if you can have enough time to be ready. So when I started thinking about this readiness, what I really thought about, and this is going to sting a little bit. Do we have a not ready yet problem? Or do we have a serving problem? Because that's what I had. I wasn't let God do his work because I wasn't serving correctly. I wasn't serving to the best of my abilities. I was putting limitations on God. So when you think about your own lives, do you have a servant's heart where you're willing to let God do the unthinkable? Or do you have a not ready yet heart? And that's something that I would really like to challenge you to meditate on that this week. Do you have a not ready yet problem, or do you have a not serving right problem? Because we're never really going to be completely ready for what God has. Because if we were, would he be God? Would he be able to exceed our expectations if we were always ready all the time? I think not. And so our final point tonight, our final point today comes from verses 20 through 26. And verse 20 says, "Early in the morning, David left the flock with the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. And he reached the camp as his army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines and facing each other. And David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran into the battle lines, and greeted his brothers." See what he did? He ran into the battle lines. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran in great fear. And now the Israelites have been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. And the king will give great wealth to the man who kills him, and he also will give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel." And David asked the man standing near them, "What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel?" This is my favorite part. He says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God?" So he's there for less than an hour. And he says, "Who is this man that should defy the armies of the living God?" That is what being ready is all about. That is what serving is all about. He had a servant's heart. But we see David, as he is instructed, in verse 20, he sets out, as his father has told him. What his father really wanted, his father wanted to make sure his sons were okay. And as David gets there, he hears the battle cry. So what would have happened was the Israelite camp would have lined up very similar to what you see in the old spaghetti westerns. They would have had their wagons in a circle. And that's how they would have slept at night, to protect themselves. Whenever the war cry goes out, though, they would have gotten into ranks. They would have come outside of their circle, would have gotten into ranks, would have marched off in line and gotten ready for war. And as they did this, as the war cry went out, David gets there. And I like the fact that it says he runs, and he ran. Now, he shouldn't have even been there. He really was kind of out of place by running into the ranks of the army. But we see a servant's heart, and I think this is why God called him a man after my own heart. I can't think of a more incredible compliment than for God to say it's a man after my own heart. He gets there, he runs straight to the battle lines, and there's a little bit of chatter, there's a little bit of gossip among the soldiers. They're still terrified, they're still chickening out. Goliath breaks rank. He walks out in front and he defies them again. And so our last point as we close the sermon today is you can't let what you think you know stop God. You can't let what you think you know of yourself, what you think of this church, what you think of your family, you can't let it stop God. Because He's going to exceed our expectations every time if we let Him. And being ready by serving is the only real way I know to tell you to do it. It's the only real way I know to tell you to get ready for the giant. Is to, the only way that I can explain how to not let God, how to not stop God, how to get out of the way of God, is to serve. And we serve every day. We serve in everything that we do. And we need to be ready. Let's all stand together.